Good morning, everybody. I have learned that if I don't put on my glasses, it's hard to read what I wrote. I'm Andrew Rudman. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center, and it is a great pleasure to have you all here and to kick off what we expect will be a really active series of events and publications related to Mexico's 2024 election, which includes the presidency as well as Congress, and numerous state-level positions such as governors, state legislators, and local positions. And these will be the largest elections in Mexican history, and they'll have a critical impact on the future of Mexico and on the bilateral relationship between the United States and Mexico. And, I think it's worth mentioning that we are seeing challenges to democracy and to voter confidence around the world, including in this country. And so during the next several months, during this election period, the Mexico Institute will explore the relevance of democracy and its ability to deliver for its citizens, because I think that at the end of the day is the key issue. If people don't believe that democracy is delivering for them, then they're inclined to support some alternative. Today we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from current federal deputy and former Secretary of Economy, Ildefonso Guajardo Villarreal, who joins us this morning in representation of the Frente Amplio por Mexico coalition, which includes the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD parties. The Mexico Institute has extended invitations to all the major campaigns and parties, and we hope they'll join us prior and or following the conclusion of their candidate selection processes. This morning, we've invited Deputy Guajardo to address the coalition's current presidential candidate selection process and its vision for Mexico should the coalition win the 2024 election. Following his opening remarks, we'll hold a follow-up conversation. I'll be joined by our Deputy Director, Leila Abed, for that conversation. And then we promise to leave some time for questions from the audience, both here at the Wilson Center and those of you watching virtually. If you've joined us virtually and would like to pose a question, please either email it to mexico@wilsoncenter.org or tag us on Twitter @Mexico Institute, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. Diputado Ildefonso Guajardo Villarreal is a distinguished public servant who's held positions in the Congress representing Nuevo León, in the federal government, and at the IMF. His federal government service includes assignments as director of the NAFTA office at the Mexican Embassy here in Washington, and that was at the time of the implementation of the NAFTA agreement. He's also had roles at SRE, at Sector, and in the Ministry of Trade and Industrial Development. More recently, he served as Secretary of the Economy during the entirety of the Peña Nieto administration, and in that role, he oversaw the renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement, which was signed on the final day of that administration. Diputado Guajardo was born in Monterrey. He obtained a BA in economics at the Autonomous University of Nuevo León and later pursued graduate studies in economics at the Arizona State University and the University of Pennsylvania. He's been a full-time professor at the Autonomous University of Nuevo León, an assistant professor at Arizona State, and at the Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania. And with that, it is my great pleasure to welcome Diputado Guajardo, and we're looking forward to his initial comments. Thank you.
Well, it is a pleasure for me to be here back to the Wilson Center. Through the years negotiating USMCA, I was here many times. But here we go again with different responsibilities and different ambitions. Thank you, Lila, for the invitation. Thank you, Andrew, for having us here. I understand that the Woodrow Wilson always characterized for being a very open institution, very devoted to democratic values, and I'm sure you will hear from the different spectrums of the political arena in Mexico here from now to the election day in June 2nd, 2024. It's a pleasure to see a lot of friends in this audience, friends that I met when I arrived for the first time in Washington in 1988, and when we started the negotiation of the first NAFTA in basically 1991. So quite many years have passed. Well, I really will not have seen how the future looked back then. I believe that the starting of trade and the starting of integration was going to put us on a high road to really improve the way North America had worked through history. But unfortunately, not always. Not all the paths are even, or obviously with the possibility of roadblocks and many challenges ahead of us. This time around, we will be facing again 2 simultaneous elections. November 2024 for the US and June 2024 for Mexico. And when that happens, things become extremely complex because the decision-making process is not necessarily done through the clarity of the best public policies or the best decisions. They get really entangled with politics to win the election. And that, unfortunately, creates a big challenge to really do the right things for the future of our countries and the future of North America. Give you a couple of examples of how the bilateral relationship is getting very complicated. As you know, the implementation of USMCA started in the summer of 2020. And let me remind you that the only policy instrument that was adopted by the new Mexican administration from the Peña Nieto administration was the USMCA commitment. I was in charge of negotiations, and I basically arrived safe to the signing date, which was November 30th of 2018 in the context of the G20 in Buenos Aires. And because we had been asked by AMLO to sign the agreement. He didn't want to sign the agreement because if his government was going to be responsible for signing it, it will be very difficult. It would have been very difficult for them to get together the different views from the different segments of Morena, because some of them, they didn't like patents or they didn't like intellectual property right protections. And for AMLO, or Andres Manuel, the new president of Mexico, was easier to get something done and turn back to his majority Senate. He has won majority back in 2018 in the Senate, and tell the Morena senators, okay, you don't like some parts of this agreement, but this a take it or leave it. And since the agreement is good for the Mexican economy, even if we don't like parts of it, we'll have to go with it. And that's what happened. The agreement was approved by a majority of Morena in the Mexican Senate right after the negotiation of the attachments on labor and the attachments on the patents for biotechnologicals. But so at the end of the day, the educational reform was set back, the financial reform was set back. They tried to really set back the energy reform. So the only instrument that was adopted by the new administration from the past administration was this commitment with the US. Now, unfortunately, that was not embraced 100% because we started not complying with the requirements on the energy agreements. Later, we did not comply with our requirements on corn to try to disrupt trade in corn using excuses as sanitary issues or, in the case of transgenicos. But one of the things that we are unfortunately suffering today is the fact that each one of those elements that are in dispute have become part of the full political negotiation that includes migration and includes also fentanyl and security issues. So the moment you start trading off items from different baskets, that moment the integrity of the agreement is at risk. And unfortunately, it's what we are witnessing. Now, hopefully, the corn controversy has a different impact on the US electorate. And eventually that is going to end up in a panel. Today is the last day for consultations. Starting tomorrow, the US can ask for the installation of a panel in the controversy on corn, because corn has a different electoral impact in the US. Corn is part of the swing states that are going to be essential for the US 24 election. Unfortunately, energy doesn't have the same impact, and energy can be on that possibility of trading off collaboration of the Mexican government to retain migration from Central America, vis-a-vis not enforcing a panel on energy. I leave these comments because I was asked to refer to the USMCA and the relationship, but now let me go and really center why my presence here today. I started participating in the primaries for the Frente Amplio por México, and at some point, just following the example of many US potential candidates, I decided that it will not be enough my knowledge and the surveys that were done about my positioning in Mexican politics, and I declined at some point to continue my presence in the primaries. I was invited by the White Front for Mexico to be their spokesperson at an international level, director de Relaciones Internacionales. And why was that necessary? Because we believe that in the last 5 to 10 years, the aim for democracy and transparency in the Western Hem has diminished. The 90s, or the early 21st century, there was this big push to really reinforce democratic process through the hemisphere. Unfortunately, today, the fact that democracies all over the continent are not giving clear results has weakened the interest and the involvement in really looking for transparent and truly democratic process. And Mexico right now is in an inflection point where everything we have built for the last 30, 40 years in terms of democratic ambition and democratic transformation, which, by the way, every electoral reform in Mexico through the last 35 to 40 years had been approved with full consensus of all political parties. That's why we were able to arrive to have very strong democratic institutions like the Instituto Nacional Electoral, like the tribunals in charge of deliberating the electoral process. But unfortunately today, democracy can be at risk in Mexico. First, the attempt by the new administration of Mexico to destroy the Electoral Institute with a constitutional reform, fortunately was voted out by Congress. But then there was the famous Opción B, which was to use a secondary law violating the Constitution to try to adopt those changes to weaken the democratic institutions in Mexico. That also failed because the Supreme Court ruled against that way to circumvent the Constitution. And finally, what is called the C option, which was to take over and control the nominations for the leadership in the Instituto Nacional Electoral. That, at the end of the day, did not happen because, fortunately, the women and men appointed to be commissioners for the National Electoral Institute have been behaving very strongly in terms of protecting democracy and electoral rights. And we'll see. Unfortunately, what we have seen at this early stage of the electoral year, the electoral year will start on September 4th and will last until the day of, after the day of the election, after the election is being called. Fortunately, in that process, the ruling of the commissioners have been in the right direction. Unfortunately, the executive is not complying with the orders the Electoral Institute is giving. To begin with, for the executive not to be involved in the electoral process, do not basically criticize the candidates of the opposition or support his own candidates. And that ruling and that law was created because of Andrés Manuel López Obrador back in the year 2006, was able to get the electoral authorities to write a binding constraint on President Fox not to keep saying that Andrés was a danger for Mexico. That's the famous Cállate Chachalaca, who was a quote by Andrés telling Fox to shut up and do not get involved in the election. Now that he's the president, he's not obeying by the same terms. Now, let me tell you about what is the basic objective of the front. When you were introducing the conference today, you said Frente Amplio por México is the coalition of PRI, PAN, and PRD. There is a missing ingredient in the way you describe it: civil society. And that's what makes the full difference between an electoral alliance that the only ambition is to get power and a coalition that is involving civil society to deliver a government coalition program where every Mexican can read their own future in that agreement. And the way the front has been constructed, it was a very difficult negotiation between political parties that own the franchise of political participation and the 6 main groups that represent civil society in Mexico. And that allowed, for the first time, to design a process to nominate the representative of the front, who eventually can be considered to become the candidate for the presidency, to include civil society in the decision-making process. The committee that is organizing the primaries is composed by 7 citizens and 6 representatives of political parties, which means that their calls are dominated by civil society. Now, every party had contenders. We started a big group of us traveling through the nation, and then the rules came out. The first step, you have to comply with 150 support signatures, at least distributed with representation in 17 states. That first stage happened already, and there were 4 candidates that meted that requirement: Santiago Krill, Xochitl Gálvez, Beatriz Paredes, and Enrique de la Madrid. The second part of the process was to have a forum, a presentation of the 4 candidates with their views about significant issues for the future of the country. That happened on the 10th of August. The second survey was conducted starting the 11th and was finished on the 13th of August. As a result of that, 3 will continue on for the last step of the process. Xochitl Gálvez, she ended up in this survey with 38% of support. Beatriz Paredes with 26% of support, and Santiago Krill with 20% of the electoral support. Enrique de la Madrid is out on this stage, and we are for a final run in which we'll have 5 debates in 5 different states of Mexico in the different regions, starting on Monday in Mexico City, following my hometown of Monterrey on Saturday the 19th, this coming Saturday, following Durango, Mérida, and I'm missing one more state. But at the end, Tijuana? Okay, it's the border town of Tijuana. At the end of that process, we are going to have a selection using 2 tools: a national survey and voting on 300 electoral districts. The vote will come from a nominal or a registration of voters that happened through the process. The ones that supported candidates plus the ones that just want to have electoral possibilities on the 3rd of September. So that is by registration. When you register, you basically had to comply with not being a member of Morena or any of the parties allied with Morena. You have to be obviously a valid voter for voting on the 24 election. Right now, I think we are close to 2,500,000 electorates already registered, and probably by the day of the election, we'll have around 3 million that will participate. The result of the election will be ponderated by 50% of the total score and 50% by the survey. Whoever wins that record, the vote and the survey, will be the representative of the Frente Amplio for Mexico. Now, obviously, this process has changed a lot of the attention in the political spectrum of Mexico. At the beginning, it seemed that for the government, it was going to be like a Sunday on the park, a very easy process to really elect one of their own in the very old traditional method, like el dedazo, remember, by selection of the president. And at that point, the opposition was not very strong, but this process has really helped a lot for the opposition to be much more present in the news, in public opinion, because you have a contrast of two internal processes that are very different. The candidates from the official party have been asked, do not debate, do not make proposals, just reinforce the objectives of the fourth transformation, which is the Bible of this government, and do not give interviews to any critical media. And on this side, nobody knows what is going to be the end result. Everybody is willing to go to any media they want. They can debate, they can make proposals, and therefore the public opinion has been extremely attracted to the White Front for Mexico method of selecting a representative, and they are getting very bored of the competition for the official party. And this is kind of going back to the way the old PRI used to do process in the 70s, you know? Extremely boring, with nothing, no news to say. You could not criticize the president. You could not propose any changes. And so this story, we know this story. The ones that have 60 years, we remember how the PRI used to do during the times of a hegemonic political party. So I end up my comments to listen to your questions and suggestions by saying it will be very important for the future of the US-Mexico relationship that whatever decision has to be made in terms of public policy will be made in the US for the sakes of the strength of the North American relationship and integration. Playing short-term politics will have as a result a very high cost in the medium and long run. This time around, it will be not enough to wait until the week of the election to see what is going to happen. You have to get involved starting next September because the integrity of the election is at risk. Observers on the week of the election will not do any good. We have to monitor what's happened from now through the full electoral year to see what is going to be clearly the way democracy is going to be protected in Mexico. Thank you. I will leave my comments here and will be willing to engage in discussion.
Wonderful. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. Deputy Ildefonso Guajardo, let me welcome you again to the Wilson Center. It's a pleasure for the Mexico Institute to have you here to discuss the future of Mexico's democracy, but also, you know, the electoral cycle is going to be the biggest in the country's history. Just a reminder to everybody joining us virtually, you can send questions to our Twitter account at Mexico Institute or to our email, mexico@wilsoncenter.org. We will be able to ask Deputy Guajardo those questions towards the end of this conversation. Diputado, I want to start off with something that you mentioned during your remarks, and that is that the Frente Amplio is not only PAN, PRI, PRD, but also civil society, which I find extremely interesting, given that this particular government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador has attacked civil society groups, journalists, scientists, feminist movements. So I'd be curious to ask how it is that you've involved the civil society into the Frente Amplio and sort of how you're going to move with them forward. And then a broader question is, what is at stake for Mexico's democracy in these elections, right? We discuss, and you have said, as did Andrew, that there's democratic decline in the Western Hemisphere and even around the world. And while it's easy to point out some of the attacks that the current president has done to democratic institutions, what does the Frente Amplio want to do to strengthen democratic institutions if it wins? But more than that, how does it not only present a united coalition, but a coalition that is able to truly govern the country, right? It's one thing to be a coalition during an electoral cycle, and another thing is to govern as a coalition.
Yes. Well, definitely, let me start with the second part of your question. What is at stake? I believe that what is at stake is freedom and democracy, definitely. I think that and let me share you, I don't know if through the time that we have been close friends, I told you some of the insights of my time in the Oval Office with Mr. Trump. Probably I shared this with you. When we visited for negotiations Washington, once in a while President Trump will greet us in his office, Luis Videgaray and myself. And do you know how he will refer to President Andrés? He will ask us, how is Juan Trump? And do you know why? It came, me cayó el 20, it synced in my mind that he was referring to our president as Juan Trump because he was seeing himself in a mirror. Although they were becoming from different backgrounds, both of them tried to avoid reality, one by saying fake news, and the other by saying, I have other data. Both of them really detested, dislike free media simultaneously. Mm-hmm. Both of them has a political strategy, polarization. Basic political strategy. Both of them lack any loyalty to their staff, because if anybody was saying something that they don't like, they just override them or fire them. And so it is amazing, although one coming apparently from the left and one coming apparently from the far right, they were a little bit much more alike. And it seems that leadership around the world is becoming very much in that sense. I see Dolia's writing very fast, the anecdote. This will be an exclusiva. Now, let me also go into your question. I do believe that we cannot allow Mexico to backtrack. Every electoral reform done since the last 30, 40 years in Mexico had done with the full consensus of all political parties. This time around, the president sent a constitutional reform to basically destroy the electoral institutions. And we have to stop because fortunately they don't have qualified majority. Mm-hmm. Now, they try, obviously, very sleazy to do it through a secondary reform, but that will violate the Constitution. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court definitely avoided that risk. And so defense of freedom of speech and defense of democracy is extremely important. Now, that is what is at stake. But then your question goes also for what is on the table that is different from the typical campaign for either a political party or a coalition of political parties, or an electoral strategy for different parties. Let me tell you that I was sharing during a private meeting. Probably many of you followed the election in Mexico State. It was quite interesting what happened there, because voting participation was very, very low, very, very minimal. It was 50% of electoral participation. Generally, for a state election, that should be over 60%. But that lack of activity from electors is the result of dissatisfaction that is not different from lower income class, middle income class, or higher income class. The government was very disappointed. They expected much more voting from their own troops in the lower income electorate. But what is going on is that people in Mexico, although the president is still very high in service, 60% of approval rate, but when you ask people, why do you approve the president? The answer is because he has good intentions. But when you ask them results and how things impact their lives in health, security, quality of education, and many other different questions, they disapprove the government and the results of the government. So, therefore, original followers of this government are disappointed, and they don't have the enthusiasm to go out and vote. But middle class and higher middle class either had that enthusiasm because they saw in the opposition a traditional process of, it was an invitation to go back to the past. So one of the things that the White Front for Mexico has well understood is that this time around, we have to present to the Mexican electorate a different offer. It is not only to criticize what is going wrong in this government, and it's not enough to tell them Seguro Popular was better, or schools, full-time schools were better, or you'll get your medicines from, I mean, that is obvious that we have to solve. But what you have to really offer is a true transformation of the system, of opportunities and access to quality of life. Because at the end of the day, we are at this point in time because of the mistakes made for the last 30 years. Although you can say today that corruption is worse, than homicides are the highest level, that organized crime is taking control of parts of the country. But what you have to really offer to the electorate is a new way to do things, is to commit to a coalition government for the first time in Mexico with the participation of civil society and basically committing all the political actors and the leaders of civil society to a government plan that really transforms things. Mexico has gone through three what we call political alternations of power. From PRI to PIN in 2000, from PIN to PRI in 2012, and then from PRI to Morena. But none of those transformations or alternances have become a real transformation of how to conduct power in Mexico. We are suffering today because of the excessive power of the presidency, but we had the chance in the last 30 years to change that. And we didn't do it because I believe it was an egoistic way to look at the concentration of power. Now, we understand that if you make excessive use of that, that's what is creating the situation that we're facing today. So check and balance, to strengthen check and balance, to strengthen autonomy of the powers, to really make solutions for the Mexican electorate to believe in democracy, you have to produce results. And unfortunately, the opposition has been too much hooked with the debates that the president wants to put out there every morning. the Mayan, el Tren Maya, the refinery, the airport. Do you know how much the average Mexican cares for those issues? Basically zero. What they need is solutions for their health problems. What they need is transportation, public transportation. What they need is how to improve their quality of life. What they need is for the social system to deliver medicines in this process. So if you don't bring the main worries of the average Mexicans to the political offer that you're going to make in terms of handling the issues that you have to handle, you are not going to get enthusiasm in this process. Fortunately, things have changed. Since the Frente organized this process, we are getting much more coverage on the media. We're getting much more time in TV and discussions in such a way that the government is worried, because at least some of our candidates are getting very close to their own candidates, which are much more enthusiastic type of dynamics in this process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diputado. There are so many topics and so many questions that come to mind, but one that we haven't talked about this morning that I think is often on the minds of folks here in Washington has been the increasing reliance on and involvement of the military in Mexican societies in ways that it had not in the past. You mentioned the infrastructure projects. The military is now responsible for control of the ports and for customs. I think one of the most recent changes was the announcement that the military would be responsible for a new airline in Mexico. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Frente's view of the increasing role of the military, and more importantly, if you're governing, how much of that would you be able to change, assuming that you would want to do that?
Yeah, it's a very, very important question. The role of the military has been changed, and surprisingly changed by a president that used to have as an opposition member, used to say that the military should go back to their to the barrels. And now he's not really meeting his promises, and to the contrary, is giving more attributions to the military. Now, that is going to have a very, very difficult effect. I tell you simple things. One of the elements that in trade negotiations we have to guarantee is trade facilitation. And by putting the militaries in customs and ports, they do not understand the element of trade facilitation, and they prioritize security vis-a-vis trade facilitation. And that, in a country that has opened its economy tremendously like Mexico, is going to have an impact on the way the economy facilitates trade. The same happens with the military doing construction. I mean, they are very efficient about obeying orders, but that puts them a lot of risk, because now transparency has been completely eradicated. You know, they are eliminating transparency, claiming that is national security, what you spend for a train or what you spend and that is exposing the military to very high temptation to get involved in corruption. And so this is not good for the military. And I can tell you, having a lot of friends, generals, traditional generals in the Mexican system, there is not an agreement, and a lot of people are very discomfort because of this new role of the military. I mean, I'm talking about generals within the system, because that exposes one of the strongest and more trustable institutions in Mexico to be derailed. Now, your question is how El Frente and this coalition project. I do believe that one of the good things is that institutionally, Mexico, within the context of Latin American countries, had a very strong and stable military presence, respecting democracy and results of elections, contrary to what happened in Argentina, Bolivia, et cetera, et cetera. there is enough credibility that a new government that changes the rules of the military will be successful, taking them back to what they should be responsible for. Because this is a temporary assignment that, given the fact that they obeyed the commander-in-chief, who is the president of Mexico, if the president asks them to finish a train, they will finish a train. If the president asks them to be in charge of customs, they will be in charge of customs. But I can guarantee you that if a new president tells them, go back to the barrels, to the cuarteles, they will go. Now, within this context, let me tell you that they are needed to construct the civil guard, but they are really lag behind. They have not devoted enough resources to really make Mexico to have a good national guard that is not militarized. Because at the end of the day, that also, when they are in charge of security within the system, they are at high risk of violating human rights, and they are not trained for that. So we really have to build. And the best example of successfully building a state police was Nuevo León in 2009, it was 2010, sorry, with the government of Medina. Fuerza Civil in Nuevo León was built within 4 years with excellent results, and it was with the collaboration of the private sector and the public sector. The famous Group of 10 of Monterrey invested a lot of money to really build a very strong force. It cannot be from one day to the other, but there is a way to build a civil force that will really improve things in Mexico.
Thank you, Deputy Guajardo. Are there any questions in the audience? Dolia, please. Is there no? I don't know if there's.
No, but
No, I think we can hear you. If not, I'll repeat it, Dolia, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lila. And
Of
thank
course.
you, Andrew, and of course, thank you, Ildefonso, for being here. I have a question. There is concern in Washington, and I suppose also in Mexico, that if the opposition candidate was to win the elections, if López Obrador will allow that victory to take place. In other words, if López Obrador would cede power, would transfer the presidency with not a big, with no resistance. You just mentioned that someone who used to be in the White House would call him, how is Juan Trump? Because he's in many ways, and you describe the aspects, very similar to Trump. So, on the basis of January 6th here, what would happen in a scenario of that sort in Mexico?
Just for a virtual.
What would the opposition do, and what would the security forces do, and what would be the response, obviously, like in the United States, of the judicial system?
Just for a virtual audience, so that they know what Dolia asked, and I'll shorten the question, but what would the opposition do if AMLO doesn't cede power, if his party or candidate loses? I think you said much more, Dolia, but I'll keep it at that so that you can answer the question.
All right.
If the system would be prepared for a scenario like that.
Sure. Yeah, one of the reasons I'm here, and I'll be traveling often here, Brussels, Strasburgo, Santiago de Chile, Brazil, is because we want to send a very clear message that we need allies of Mexico around the world to start looking deeply into the Mexican electoral process. It will not be sufficient to wait until the election week and send observers. The consistency of the electoral process starts in the first week of September. And we have to be really monitoring every step towards that end. And the risk of these elections this election are many. Last year, 100 candidates were killed by organized crime in the 2021 election. The involvement of criminal groups in the election of Sinaloa and Tamaulipas and Sonora had strong evidence of how those elections were infiltrated by groups of organized crime. And therefore, my party has introduced an initiative to strengthen the instruments of the electoral authorities to control and definitely make part of the observancy process of the election how organized crime is infiltrated in different electoral processes. That's one thing. Secondly, when we are looking at the election in Mexico, definitely for us it's very clear that voters' participation in the election is going to be a very high element for the opposition to have a chance. The more electors participate, the better chances are to have a win that can be widened, like at least more than 5 percentage points of difference in the election process. We need to have a result that can be clearly defended in terms of a clear victory in the election process. If the result is very narrow and is very, very close, unfortunately, the risk of what you are describing is very high. Therefore, the first element that we have to put forward is for Mexican society to really go out and participate and just make it very clear who the winner of the election is. If the scenario is not that, and we have a very narrow victory, we cannot eliminate the possibility that the government will not recognize the results of the election. That is a scenario that is important. But on that front, that's what we want governments from the left in Chile or Brazil or in the United States or in Europe to be involved in the process. So to have a strong international support in terms of monitoring the Mexican election and making sure that we will have a very clear standing on the international circuits of what's going on in the Mexican election. And definitely we are against the control of 22 governors of budget. They are transferring resources from the federal to the state government where monitoring is more difficult on how they use those resources to support illegal practices of using fiscal resources in the election. We have to be very careful in terms of how the servidores, los siervos de la nación, are delivering social programs and the kind of messages they are delivering to the constituents that are depending on government support. So there are too many activities that have to be closely followed from here to the day of the election. We cannot discard that scenario, but we have to make sure that the results are sufficiently wide for us to really maintain the government online and do not abusing the results of, or not recognizing the results of the election.
We have a question from an online participant. He says, what do you think it will take for voters to have buy-in into the Frente's propositions and to bring voters that previously voted for Morena or those who abstained from voting to vote for an alternative?
The first part of the question was?
What do you think it will take for voters to have a buy-in into the Frente's proposition? Basically, how do you bring former voters for Morena into the coalition? Let
me say very clear that when we were organizing the primaries for the White Front for Mexico, it was very clear that we cannot have a candidate that is on the extreme. There were a couple of candidates that were very voiceful and very radical that appealed to the extreme anti-AMLO scenario. My own view and the view of many in the front, is that this election cannot be, you cannot win this election from the extreme. Therefore, you have to have candidates that will appeal to this group that has been disappointed by results and by the commitment to democracy and by the fact that they are losing many, like for instance, it is incredible that the researchers at the National Institute of Research, CONACYT, they now are against AMLO's government. And those guys voted for AMLO. You can find many groups that supported him because of his promises, and now they are not with the government. And I believe that the only way to really assure those votes and for them to support an alternative is to be able to write in black and white what are going to be the commitments and the goals and the projects of a coalition government, where regardless of who if you are going to appoint a minister of finance from one party or a minister of foreign affairs from another party, that the project is going to be upheld and committed by all and deliver. So, and the project can be like a Bible where every voter can read what is in for them in terms of future solution for their problems in security, in economy, in transportation, in household. I mean, it could be definitely the instrument. The Chileans, in a different context, were able to get out from Pinochet by a coalition that put together parties of very different spectrums. What really made it for them was the project to really take Chile to a new stage, and they were able to win for 4 consecutive terms the elections in Chile. And the coalition in Chile became stronger because they deliver on their commitments. And so I do believe that by spelling out what is the purpose of this coalition government and what will be the main aims, do not expect to read there things that had to do with the individual's own definitions. Like, for instance, it will be impossible to get PRI and PAN to agree on abortion, or to have, because even within PRI, there are different positions. Right. So you will not read in that objective things that had to do with issues of a very personal or individual elements. Every party has different views on those things, but definitely in terms of policy, human rights, and many other elements, it will be part of this offer.
Ariel?
A question on foreign policy. Thank you. A question on foreign policy. There have been some signs that have raised eyebrows in the intelligence and national security community in the United States regarding the position of Mexico towards Ukraine. First, of course, there has been an increase that has been documented by my colleagues here, Dolian, and there have been some other signs that can be taken as ambiguous in the position of the Mexican government towards Ukraine. Yes, they condemn it in the United Nations, but at the same time, they don't really take other actions in favor of Ukraine. Only last week, the current chancellor said that Mexico strongly condemned the invasion of Ukraine, but at the same time, she said that the United States should stop sending weapons to Ukraine without saying what Russia should do first. So my question is, what is the position of the front, and what do you envision will be the position of the candidate of the opposition in Mexico towards Ukraine? Will it be different, and how? Thank you.
Hola, qué gusto verte. He used to be, every time that I went out of USTR to get some air, he was there getting the news. on how the agreement was going.
Crazy on the air.
Yeah. Let me start by saying that for the Frente Amplio, for the White Front for Mexico, it is clear that we are part of North America in terms of a security challenge, and obviously we do not, the interest of Mexico in the integration process that we have built for the last almost 30 years is not only centered in economics, but this centered in a political alliance with our partners in North America. If the government of Mexico today is pricing and enjoying the benefits of an agreement, and the president very often in Las Mañaneras says, you see, we are doing very well, we are getting a lot of investment from Asia, and nearshoring is great in Mexico. But in today's world, you cannot have double standards. If you are definitely interested in the integration of North America, that requires also to be consistent with your neighbors geopolitically. You cannot say you have a good relationship with Washington when the Cumbre de las Américas is going to happen in Los Angeles, and then you decide not to show up. And not only that, but you make calls for other leaders in Latin America not to show up for the conference. I mean, that is not a good neighbor, and is not even a good partner. The same happened when the conflict started and the economic embargo was applied to Russia. Mexico did not align with that embargo. And definitely that inconsistency is going to have an impact on your domestic strategies related to North America. Why? Because nearshoring in this context is not only nearshoring, has to be ally shoring. You have to build the trust of your neighbors to invest in strategic fields like the new digital era, like the new electromobility. So makes no sense to hope for a successful economic integration and be part of the new challenges technologically and innovation when you are not really doing your part in integrating in the defense and positioning of the North American region. So for most of the members of the Frente, this has to be consistent. You are an economic ally and you are a geopolitical ally in this process. The future of Mexico is not with China. The future of Mexico is not with Russia. The future of Mexico is in North America.
So we are kind of getting close on time, but maybe I can take 2 or 3 questions together, and Deputy Guajardo, you can answer them in 3 minutes. Yes, please.
Apparently, international trade today. You mentioned how Mexico has not been complying with energy and with phytosanitary rules in USMCA/TMEC. I wanted to ask you about the U.S. lack of compliance on the auto panel and what that means for auto trade between the 3 countries, and whether Mexico and Canada have any leverage to get the U.S. to comply with that panel ruling.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Definitely. Now, well,
Can we take
3 minutes?
maybe-
Yeah, let's
maybe
take all of them.
Maybe,
Okay.
yeah. Diego?
So you guarantee that I don't take more than 3 minutes.
It's good strategy, right?
Thank you. Diego Marroquin, Brookings Institution. I was wondering if you could give us more of your thoughts regarding the role of the military as it correlates to USMCA compliance. We were talking about the military not being exposed to the same accountability controls that like civil servants or people in the private sector are. If you could offer more thoughts on that and how their increased role in construction infrastructure, border security could impact USMCA compliance. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you, Diego. Is there one more? Yeah, we'll take one in the back and then.
Hola, diputado. So you mentioned concern, one with the centralization and lack of checks and balances with the executive branch, and you also mentioned that the coalition is the first of its kind. So do you see the coalition as something that's going to show up in future elections as more of a normal thing, or is this kind of something of extraordinary measures where these parties came together to, get Morena out in a way?
Sure. All right. Let me start from the last question. I do believe that today the response of the front is an extraordinary effort to really contain the deteriorations of institutions and democracy and freedom in Mexico. And the incentives are aligned because even though the political system in Mexico has been designed for full control of the parties by the leadership, they are aligned incentives to really come together, include civil society in the process, and really put forward for the first time in our history a project that has a main element to transform the country. As I was telling you, we have many transitions of power or transmissions of power, but not a true deep change. Today, for instance, regardless of the promises and regardless of the fact that they have said that la mafia del poder, and today the number of players being benefited by government contracts is smaller and with less transparency than used to be. The levels of corruption in Mexico in international indicators has worsened tremendously. And so everything is going that way. But I do believe that if the future, if this coalition becomes government, we will have to see a redesign of how power is defined in Mexico, how the balance and checks system had to be transformed, and how to redefine the law of political parties to give a much more openness for the political party system, to be much more transparent and much more open to democracy and the participation of civil society in the process. So I do believe that what we have to accomplish will be good enough to keep on reinforcing the possibilities of a coalition in the future. The second question of Diego. The role of the military definitely is going to have an effect on what is going on today in Mexico in terms of international trade and investment. For instance, there is a lot of new investments coming from Asia into Mexico thanks to the new requirements of the agreement, much more stronger rules of origin requiring more supplies to be made in North America. But at the same time, all the operation of customs has to go through a very, very, very difficult process, which is definitely become less efficient with this new administration in the hands of militaries. I went all the way to Gaul to talk to the Undersecretary of Defense to tell me that my full team that had participated in NAFTA was willing to train these guys to understand the meaning of international trade and facilitation, because regardless if we agree or not, at least we have to make our best effort that they are well trained in terms of facilitation. That is going to have an impact definitely in the efficiency of international trade. And then the first question, and my Alzheimer's is quite strong. The first question was on the
Auto part.
Auto
Auto parts, the commitment on auto parts, yes. Let me tell you that, unfortunately, the lack of compliance of Canada in dairy, the lack of compliance the U.S. on auto parts, and the lack of compliance of Mexico in energy and now corn are definitely putting our agreement at risk. And that is happening in part due to politics, obviously. And unfortunately, that's going to have an effect on the what we hope to deliver from this agreement. And let me just tell you the terrible impact on the Mexican side. Not compliance with the energy part of the agreement is not only affecting investors on energy, it's affecting the future of manufacturing in Mexico. Because many of the, for instance, automakers that are in Mexico have corporate obligations to become clean energy factories within the next 5 to 10 years. And if we do not supply those energies, where do you think they are going to make the next localization decision? There is not going to be in Mexico. And therefore, that has a very wide effect on the manufacturing economy of Mexico. And so, and why are we in this situation? Because politically, for the Biden administration, it's more attractive for Andrés Manuel López Obrador to do the dirty job of retaining Central Americans on the border without having capacities, budget, protection of human rights, and terrible conditions for migrants. Remember the 40 guys that were burned in a government facility in El Juarez. I mean, the responsible for that situation, probably the direct implication is for the guard that locked them up and let them burn. But the real responsible one is the one that admitted that the U.S. considers Mexico as a third secure country to maintain migrants. And that was not the policeman in charge of that facility. That was the negotiation that was made in Washington, where Marcelo Ebrard was present. And Pompeo and Trump keep reminding us of that negotiation. So the fact that you are exchanging chips from one area of negotiation to the other one is terrible. We used to call a concept in foreign policy of compartimentización de la política exterior, which means if you are negotiating migration, you don't cross that negotiation with trade. And when I went to negotiate TPP with Mike Froman, he wanted me to commit some changes in the constitutional labor laws, and I told him, wrong window. No, I mean, my negotiations are going to be on trade issues, nothing to do with things that are the responsibility of the Mexican Senate. And that helped because the complexity of the bilateral relation is so big that the moment you start crossing items, it's a never-end game. You have to really focus in every aspect, in every issue, isolated, in order to really get results. And so what I'm understanding is that la Secretaria de Economía de México, Raquel Buendrostro, has mentioned that there is going to be an agreement on autos, which is going to be terrible, because I believe again, probably we are going to make concessions that are not good for the Mexican auto industry, vis-a-vis getting some other things delayed. And that at the end is not the best we can do.
On behalf of the Mexico Institute, Deputy Ildefonso Guajardo, it's been a pleasure to have you here at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for visiting us. To everybody that's here in person and joining virtually, thank you all for being here. And we look forward to seeing everybody in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.